Welcome to Part 6 of Operations on the Burrlington Northern, cleaning up Delta Yard. It's going to involve a lot of switching, both the narrow gauge and standard gauge, so it should be a lot of fun. I'm Burr Stewart, and I'm the owner and operator of this model railroad layout in Seattle, representing Burrlington Northern operations in approximately 1973. If you've been here for some of our previous videos, you'll know that every time we make a mistake, we tend to leave the mess in the Delta Yard in Everett. Today I thought we would take a step back and clean up the Everett Yard so that it's ready for use in future videos. As you may remember from Part 3 of this series, we were using this beautiful SD9 locomotive to switch cars that had been dropped off by an eastbound freight, mainly because we had incorrectly put them in the eastbound train to begin with. In a subsequent video, Part 4, operating the narrow gauge, we accidentally spilled a hopper car from the narrow gauge up above my hand there down to the main line, just past where the engine is, and completely plugged it up with spilled copper ore. This meant that the main line to the right side of Delta Yard was plugged by the accident, and we're going to need to work the yard using the switch lead on the left. Therefore, our first move is to pull the switch engine out of the yard, run it around the cars, and start working it from the left side. Once we have the standard gauge cars in Delta sorted out, we'll turn our attention to finishing up the narrow gauge switching work, and then we'll clean up the mess created by the narrow gauge spill, and finally we'll be able to take a cut of cars from Delta over to the Bayside Yard, where they'll be connected to transfer freights towards the north, south, and east. This also gives us a chance to put this switch engine in the roundhouse for a while for servicing, and we can use other engines for subsequent work, in case you're getting sick of this gorgeous thing. Let's just take a minute in the sidebar to review the color coding system for the waybills, because we'll be looking at those at several points in today's video. As you can see from the image on the right, the color code logic is that southbound cars are the hot colors such as red, yellow, and orange. Northbound cars are the cold colors like blue. Purple represents heading towards headquarters in Minneapolis to the east. And the green represents the center of the layout here in Everett. You can also see from the black dot that we're currently located in the Delta Yard, but that trains to the south and north probably are better handled from the Bayside Yard, which is why at the end of this video we'll be taking cars back over to Bayside. As you may remember from Part 3, our eastbound train dropped off 2 cars that were headed towards the north and 2 cars that were not supposed to be on the train at all, to be taken back to Interbay. Now what we're going to do is connect all 4 of those cars into one cut and combine them with other cars in the yard that all need to be taken back to Bayside for putting in the appropriate train. The only cars that stay in Delta are the ones that are headed for eastbound destinations such as Skykomish, Wenatchee, Spokane, or back to the East Coast and Midwest. Before we get ahead of ourselves, let's stop the train and check the car cards for these 4 cars and make sure we know what we're doing. What a smooth running locomotive. The first card there is the locomotive card, which is obviously going to stay with the train. Then we have the GN and NP cars that are going back to Interbay, and the boxcar and gondola that are headed north out of Bayside Yard. So that's good. Now the second track behind them, it looks to have a northbound tank, an eastbound tank, a southbound tank, a local tank, and several other Mukilteo tanks, and a GN boxcar going to Mukilteo. Now the Mukilteo cars can stay here because Mukilteo served out of Delta, but the other cars need to come with us. One of the things you'll notice on this layout is that I'm kind of a stickler for having the railroad car wheels be rusted up as on the prototype. I never saw a bright silver wheel on a real railroad, so whenever I take in a freight car, the first thing I always do is to paint the wheels a rust color. If you ever notice a shiny metal wheel on this layout, please let me know and I'll correct it immediately. Well, we have the classic switching puzzle problem here because the second and fourth tank cars from the right are the ones that need to be left here in Delta. So we have to fish them out of the consist and then take everything else over to Bayside. It won't take too long, but longer than we would like. Unless you really enjoy watching other people do switching moves, which I certainly do when I'm rail fanning, which is I guess what you're doing right now, so enjoy. You wouldn't normally see a string of 4 identical tank cars like this, but these are brand new cars from tangent scale models, 1917 design cars that I just recently installed on the layout, and this is their very first operation of being split up into their different destinations as indicated in their waybills. It's winter here, so I seem to have put on my bear suit in order to stay warm. You can see while we're doing this switching, I'm trying to keep track of the car cards. When I move a car from one track to the other, I try to move the car card over from the one box to the other, just so we don't get too confused. Two down, two to go. You can see I'm not having too much trouble uncoupling with the little barbecue skewer picks. This layout has a combination of the Katy number 5 couplers and the smaller scale head Katy number 58 couplers. And a lot's been written about how they are or are not compatible or what the best thing to do with them is. But honestly, I've found with a mixture of these two different coupler types, it's still not difficult to uncouple, and I don't have reliability issues on grades. Oops, I seem to have forgotten in my enthusiasm to separate out those two tank cars on the front track that the other three cars next to them also need to stay here. So I'm going to have to shove those back. Yet another error to add to the list of errors on these various videos. Which isn't that unrealistic now that I think about it. Many times when I'm in an operating session, I'll start a switch move and then realize that I uncoupled the wrong car, pulled the wrong part of the cut out, and I end up having to do extra work. If I had just kept ahead of myself better, I might have perfected it, but nobody's perfect. Now, all 5 of those cars sitting on the front track are going to stay here in Delta, and everything else that we've been playing with here needs to be pulled over to Bayside Yard on the other side of the peninsula. Now I'm shoving the entire cut that we want to take to Bayside into the siding track in front so that I can run around it with the locomotive and pull it towards the right through the tunnel over to Bayside. But as I analyze this, I could have just left them on the back track and run around with the engine. That's what happens when you're videotaping and running a locomotive and trying to keep track of your switch job all at the same time. It's really useful in operating sessions sometimes to have 2-person crews, and that way one person can run the engine and the other person can keep track of what the best switching move might be given the waybills on the cut that you're working with. While we're running around the train, let's take a look at our car cards and see if everything's in order. Those are the 5 cars we're leaving here, and they've all got the correct color code, green and purple. And it looks like all the ones we're taking are either the 2 white cars to return to Seattle, the blue cars to head north, and that 1 pink card to return to Seattle. And then we have our engine card as well. And we've checked to see that all the cards are in the same order as the cars in the train. Very good. Now back to our runaround maneuver. Now we're all ready to hitch up to our cut and test the air brakes, and we could pull over to Bayside. Except for one thing. Back in video part 4, if you watched that, there was an accident on the narrow gauge which has blocked the main line. But before we call out the maintenance of way crew, let's clean up the narrow gauge yard that we left from part 4. As you probably remember, in part 4 we ran out of time at the end of the video, so we just left these 4 gondola cars and a boxcar and caboose on the main yard track in the narrow gauge part of Delta Yard. Today we'll use this beautiful little switcher RGS-41 to break down and put away this train. The first thing we have to do is back the engine up so we can get on the right track to couple onto our train. This engine we're using is a stock Blackstone C19. It runs extremely well, but I haven't had a chance to fine-tune the CV settings in the Tsunami decoder that makes it run. When I get around to doing that, you'll see it being even smoother. In case you're wondering what that track with 3 rails is, let me explain. This is an HO scale layout, which has a ratio of 1 to 87, and the standard gauge line would be 4 foot 8.5 inches between the rails, using British measures. In Colorado and some other places in history, the railroads also built 3-foot gauge railroads, which are 36 inches between the rail. What we have here is an interchange yard between the narrow gauge on the right and the standard gauge on the left, with some dual gauge trackage that both the steam engines and the diesels can use. In my fantasy, the Colorado narrow gauge actually expanded all the way to Everett, Washington, and competed with the standard gauge trains for this business. So it's a lot of fun to be able to operate both narrow gauge and standard gauge on one HO scale train layout. Well, we've managed to shove their entire cut up the grade on the east end of town, and now we're pulling it back into the main yard lead track so we can put these various cars in the correct track. First, we need to unhitch the caboose. Next, we can spot that lone boxcar on yard track 2. Track 1 is reserved for narrow gauge intermodal cars. We'll get to that in some future video. You can see on the right I've cut out a turntable pit, but I haven't installed it yet. I'm looking forward to that though. If you watched video number 4, you might have noticed that the water tank was in a different spot. I moved it over here next to the turntable just for fun to see what I thought of it. As you can see, now we're shoving the 4 loaded gondolas into yard track 3. All that's left is to put away the engine and the caboose, and then we can go clean up that mess of copper ore on the delta Y. It's ironic that I don't have all my rails painted after I told you that I never let a freight car on the layout without rusting its wheels. That's a real discrepancy in my standards. Track always looks a lot better when you paint the rails. It's just a question of getting around to it. Well, now we can feel good about finally putting away that train that we brought down the hill in part 4. And you can see here a nice overview of the narrow gauge yard and the main line that heads up the helix. Now we turn our attention to the accident that happened when we accidentally knocked a loaded gondola car full of copper ore down onto the main line at the Delta Y. For fun, let's take an engineer's view of what it looked like when they tried to use the main line after that accident. The switch to the left goes between Delta and Bayside Yard. The switch to the right heads up towards Vancouver, British Columbia. Now you see a prime example of the disadvantage of loose open loads in model gondola cars. Now let's take a look at it from the other side. This is approaching Delta from Bayside, and we're using a RS-11 locomotive, which has a wonderful sound to it. Not surprisingly, the accident doesn't look any better from this side. At the risk of pointing out the obvious, if this had been a real railroad, those two trucks would have fallen right off the car and been lying in the dirt. So, how to clean this mess up? First, we'll pick up the gondola car and put it back on the track. Next, we'll get our vacuum cleaner, put a sock in the tube so that we can capture all of this material and suck it up with a vacuum cleaner. There, that looks pretty good. Now let's take the excess ore that we just vacuumed up and put it back in the ore bin. I use a nice thin nylon sock for this to make it easy to pull out. It doesn't look like much, but every little bit helps. Now finally we can put some of that ore in a little container and pour it back into the gondola car. After I knocked that gondola car off with a sloppy uncoupling maneuver back in part 4 of this video series, I don't know why I would now take the risk of pouring the ore into the car while it's in that same precarious spot. But it's too late to change it now, so here we go. So, the main line being cleared up, the narrow gauge yard being put away, we can now finish up the video by taking these cars over from Delta to Bayside Yard, where they will be put into future trains. The paint is so red on this CB&Q locomotive, I'm tempted to wish you a Merry Christmas, or make a comment that the locomotive is dressed up like Santa Claus. But as I've said several times, one of the joys of modeling 1973 and the Burrlington Northern is the huge variety of locomotives and paint schemes that all belong right here in my basement. Looks like the CB&Q wasn't the only railroad that was fond of Santa Claus. Coming into the North Ladder and Bayside Yard in Everett, we'll slow down so that the brakeman can get out and flip that first switch to take us off the main line and on to track 1 in what's called the new yard. On the right of the main line, you see an intermodal train called the Pacific Zip, which was the Burrlington Northern's first foray into expedited cross-country trailer and container on flat car service. In real life, this train would not be sitting in a yard any amount of time because it was on a very expedited schedule. We'll cover the operation of the Pacific Zip later in a subsequent video. We've uncoupled from our cut of cars and we can move the engine into the engine terminal facilities in Everett. The engine terminal is on the other side of the main line, so we have to come out on the main, stop and flip this switch again, and then move over onto the engine service track. I guess in this case the brakeman was able to jump out of the engine, run up and flip the switch, and then jump back onto the footboards without the engineer having to bring the engine to a complete stop. Now we need to jump out and flip one more switch so we can move into the engine terminal. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video, part 6 of a continuing series of operations videos. Come back next time. I hope to do not only the Pacific Zip, but also to take a look at the Rock Train, the Sky Local, and a number of other very interesting trains that operated in the Seattle area during the 1970s. Before we call this operation finished, let's check with our car cards and make sure they're in the right box. Those are the cars that we brought in. We parked them on the first track in the new yard in Bayside and Everett. So you can see we need to stick them right in that box. And then the loco card needs to go over in the locomotive servicing area box, way over on the right there, along with all the other locos that are sitting in the servicing facility. So now we've done our paperwork and we can go back to admiring the roundhouse. That sanding tower was kit bashed from a plastic model with some custom styrene strips by Tim Taylor. In the middle there we have a stock Walthers turntable and a series of random locomotives that happen to be parked in the roundhouse at the moment. A beautiful Fairbanks Morse NP switcher, an SD9 with BN paint, some Great Northern Jeeps and switchers, and in the back you have the cars that are serving the Scott Paper Mill in Everett. On the left there you have a group of dancers to celebrate my wife and my enjoyment of swing dancing. Someday I'll have the soundtrack for those dancers playing at the station when you pass by. So that's all for episode 6. This is Burr Stewart wishing you much fun with trains.